Thank you for joining today's conversation. What changes when commercial teams stop analyzing data and start operating with it? The next wave of pharma transformation will be defined by companies which can use data for actions in the context of the organization. So, today we are going to dig deeper into how AI is being put into practice beyond traditional dashboards. What are the building blocks? And how the future of pharma is going to be impacted through data and AI intelligence. I'm excited to host Arvind Balasundaram, one of the leaders in pharma and life sciences space at the intersection of data, AI, analytics. Arvind has been working at the topmost levels to drive decisions from data and creating business impact. Welcome to Applied AI Outcomes, Arvind.
Hi, Ramendra. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk. I'm really excited about our discussion and I'm really looking forward to the next hour.
Same here. Arvind, before we dive in, if you could take a moment to help us with a bit of intro and also help us with your journey in the data and AI world.
Sure, Ramendra. I have spent most of my career in the insights analytics discipline, almost 30 years working in big pharma and in biotech. I started my career actually at Pfizer. Spent some time at Bristol Myers Squibb, Johnson and Johnson, and Sanofi on the big pharma side, and most recently at Regeneron in the biotech space. And I think what I want to say or summarize more than anything else is I think I've been very lucky that I've been able to participate in this journey from a time of scarcity when we didn't have much, all the way to a time when we have a lot. And that journey, I'm sure you and I are going to touch upon elements of that, has been a fascinating one. And the one thing that has not changed about all this and all those 30 years is that ultimately data is useful only when it's valuable. Now, the notion of what that means has changed, but that particular piece hasn't changed. And so that's kind of the beacon for what I've been trying to do in different jobs and through this whole journey. So that's what I would tell you in a nutshell.
Excellent. Thanks so much for the intro, Arvind. Arvind, you have built global analytics and AI teams from ground up, and of course, use them for putting together the decision making across organizations. One thing which I wanted to check, right, from a data strategy perspective, what do you think still is lacking in pharma and biotech companies? What are they getting wrong? And secondly, we all know the importance of data being the foundational element, right? But what should be set up on the data side for the long term AI success in these organizations?
Yeah, I think this is the $6 million question, right? So let me just focus and start with a couple of terms that you use. I'll actually introduce three terms which I think are very critical for this
Hmm.
discussion, right? One is I think there's confusion on what data strategy means. Data strategy, I think, is separate from business strategy, which is separate from what I will call AI ambition. The three are very related and connected because the lifeblood, I think, of business, especially in the next few years and in the AI ecosystem, is going to be data-driven strategic choices, right? And so data strategy in and of itself is not going to be able to give you everything. Business strategy is the one that is going to give you the real success and the impact and all of that. But then if you have business strategy sitting kind of in one place, data strategy kind of being assembled and built in another place, and then you're throwing darts at various AI things to kind of get it going, none of that's going to work, right? So I think the big missing piece in many companies is that these three things are fairly mature, but they're not very well aligned, right? Now let's focus a little bit on the data strategy piece, right? I think, Ramit, a couple of things have really changed, right? One is I think it's become very important to operate what I will call much higher in the analytics journey. And what do I mean by that? Right. So the analytics journey has four steps, right? So you start with data, then you have information, then you have knowledge, and then you have wisdom. let's focus on the first two steps, right? If you're playing only in data, you're pretty much focused on acquiring data, ingesting data, housing it all in one place. And those were all very important when our technology was a little older, right? I think the parameters of a lot of those things have changed. It's very important now to operate from the vantage point of much higher up in that analytics journey or analytics funnel. You've got to kind of let strategy drive what your data is going to be used for. And if you're not doing that, you're just mulling around with data, you're not connecting the parts. So the pieces for me, to going back to your question, that I think are still missing in a number of organizations that have very mature data stacks, is it's still not connected. Data is not connected. It's still very siloed in the life sciences. And then, the analogy I use a lot is, the human body has all these organs and all of these things, but you need connective tissue to kind of be the scaffold for all of them, right? That scaffold, I think, is fundamentally missing in a number of data foundation, attempts. And so that is a very critical piece in my mind for what is going to make organizations successful in the near future.
Right. Excellent. And I think that's where probably organizations also need to look at, how the agentic system are going to evolve, while putting to, and I have a couple of questions on this a bit later, but the thing which is resonating with me a lot is that, having that scaffolding, and also keeping in mind that it's not only humans who are going to act, it's also the agents which are going to be the actors of tomorrow. And that's where the stitching has to be done in a manner that it is a bit future ready as well. Excellent.
It's really interesting you stitching, because I talk about things like a quilt, because in analytics there are three very important things, right? One is what I call curation, which is you can't build a quilt unless you know which pieces of cloth kind of make the quilt. And then
Right.
you want to bring rows together and columns together so there's a pattern, and that's that integration piece, and then the whole quilt has to come together in a story. So I'm really happy you're using stitching, because that's one of the analogies I love to use as well.
Arvind, one of the things I read, in some of your comments, and we spoke about it earlier as well, was around dashboards. You said that dashboards are becoming extinct. In couple of discussions, we have also alluded to a similar stuff, that there'll be the kind of work which has been done around dashboards that has to change, and probably there will be a new interface which is going to come up. And that's where, I wanted to understand from your point of view, what do you think this new interface should be for a commercial leader, let's say, someone who has to make decisions around various aspects of commercials and pharma life sciences. And the other part is that how do you get these systems to ensure that there is better decision making which is happening. Because the other aspect of this is that, how the insights are generated, but then how the decisions are made based on the insight. So it will be great to understand more on this front from you.
Yeah, so let me start with the whole expiration of dashboards, because I've heard a lot of people make reference to that. There's a lot of people who believe dashboards have a place. So let me just qualify what I mean by that, right? So I don't think
Hmm.
dashboards are ever going to be going away from the standpoint of being able to report numbers, right? So I think they do a great job with reporting numbers. So the bigger question is that what the business of the future is going to need, right? And let's go into that environment for a second, and what we're all in right now, right? Number one, I think the stakeholders we're talking about, these are the end users of analytics, or ultimately the data. Their engagement and experience with analytics has fundamentally changed. How so, right? One is, I think it's become what I keep calling a more immersive environment. I don't mean by that the traditional definition of immersive with putting Google glasses on and not. What I mean by that is that analytics consumption has drilled up the role of exploration, agility, visualization. These were all nice to haves once upon a time, and they were still, when we were talking about visualization, we were talking about static looks, right? Now it's a lot more than that, right? I think there's this expectation that I may not know the fundamentals of analytics and machine learning and what have you, Bayesian methods, but I still want to be able to go into a lot of data that I know I bought, and I want immediate results, and I want to be able to play with it, right? And now we have platforms and technologies and a framework that allows that, right? So I think this is a very major transformation in the consumption of analytics, which I think a lot of folks tend to kind of gloss over, but it is what is going to drive, in my mind, the evolution of frameworks, and why I call dashboards are heading towards extinction, right? And why so, right? Number one, I think because of the immersive nature of the engagement I'm talking about, folks want the ability to be able to tap into model pipelines, into vast streams of data, make connections, play with it in kind of I ask something in a natural language text query, get it back quite quickly, run iterations and scenarios of that, be able to map that, see that, compare things. This is the user interface that we are going to be getting very soon. It also means the whole notion of the traditional KPI has morphed because the speed of business has become real time. When you have real time business, you need to have KPIs that are dynamic, right? So as my business is moving, I need to know what I need to do differently, right? That is not the traditional KPI of dashboards, which is very similar to watching a movie, looking at stills in the movie. I mean, if you take any movie and think about, hey, I'm watching the movie in real time versus, just snapshots of the movie, you get what I'm talking about, right? That is the expectation. Are we there today? Not yet, but we're heading there, right? So what the adaptive nature or the simulative nature I'm talking about in analytics and the consumption of data is going to enable is this ability to move between states and focus on that movement rather than just the states themselves. And those are going to be very, very critical for good business decisioning, right? The second piece that you talked about, which I love, is this emphasis on decisioning, right? And this again goes back to the point I made earlier. When you operate higher in the analytics funnel, your strategy is driving what data and analytics are necessary to help you make decisions. So unless your data is actually influencing a decision, unless it's driving an insight, unless it's having a measurable impact, your data is just expensive acquisition, right? And we have started going into that mode, right? So the whole evolution in the future is not going to be get me every data that I can get my hands on. It's going to be more, what is the least amount of data that I can get that helps me get to a quick, agile decision, right? And how do we become perfect imperfectionists, like I keep saying, right? That is where the gold is. And that is where we're going to step into and away from these static looks at things. They'll never go away, but the use in some of the more impactful decisions is going to get significantly diminished. And that's what I mean by dashboards are dying.
I think thank you for that. I think it's a great viewpoint. And moving up the analytics value chain, especially moving towards decisioning, I think that is definitely going to happen as data gets streamlined, and also data is getting a lot more importance in terms of from an organization perspective as compared to what it was earlier. I see organizations getting way more serious about managing the data sets. The processes which were known are getting implemented. And of course, there is with the agentic ecosystem and with the technology moving forward, things have become easier as well. However, coming back to this point related to dashboard, right? How the dashboard may change. One thing which is there is talk to your data. Definitely, that is something which will be part of that. You have a dashboard in terms of KPI monitoring, which may still remain there, but it may get, more real time, more agile from that perspective. There are two other things which I was thinking while you were giving the POVs on this point. One was, what about insights? Let's say, are if the systems are throwing insights based on whatever data is there, recommendations, right? Do you see that, the systems getting mature to the extent that, they'll be able to throw meaningful insights to the decision makers and give the right recommendations as well as part of this new interface?
I think, I think insights and the richness of insights coming out of data will go up, and there will not only will it go up with the engines we're using, there's going to be an expectation of them providing that. Right now,
Hmm.
will the machines themselves make the eventual decision on the insight? Probably not, and definitely not in the life sciences, right, where we have other issues and risk aversion, all of that. But the augmentation nature of engines to help provide insight, absolutely, right? Because you know you got to remember, now ambiguity is driven by plenty rather than scarcity. Like I said, I remember when very early in my days, we were more in the detection game looking for data points to support a hypothesis. Right now,
Yeah.
it's the opposite problem. So, yes, we are, as humans, we are now bound with what we can kind of consume to come up with insights. And what is an insight, right? So let's go to that. Uh, an insight is something that unlocks a tension that exists that wasn't discovered before, right? And that's how I like to define it, right? If you're just arriving at something is already known, that's not really an insight. That's just a fact.
Yeah.
But an insight uncovers some pattern or tension that exists that you can use based on your understanding. And that's where AI and this overwhelming amount of data we have, and the agnostic structure of data, all of those make it really attractive to find these counterintuitive insights. And I know we'll get into that piece shortly, but these are huge changes in the way we kind of consume what we used to call data. But now the quality of information coming out of data has become the most important thing, right? And that expectation from stakeholders, from the C suite, give me quality information and insight. Don't just throw more data at me. This is the key, right? And I think, to your point, dashboards and everything else we used to look at as one off activities, standard things we kind of do, are now being questioned and say, hey, do we need these dashboards? How many of these do we need? And what are we really learning from this? What's changing and what am I doing differently on my decision as a result of it? Not much, right? So we're taking a more critical view of it. They'll always be around, but their role in driving decisions, I think, as I mentioned before, is going to go down.
All right. Arvind, moving on to, pharma business as such, right? If you look at, there has been a discussion around the brand perception versus the active patient experience, right? And how experience may drive the future, which we have seen in many industries as well, right? But how is this going to play out, in pharma industry? And also, what role will AI and data play in putting this, new way of looking at, brands and pharma industry? Also, what are the challenges, right, which people are facing in terms of putting together this experience side of things, at the center?
So this, I think, like you mentioned, life science has been a little behind compared to some of the other industries, but there's a reason for that, right? Because
Mhm.
our data is quite disconnected, and the patient experience. In our industry, our demand model is derived, right? So the patient doesn't ultimately write the product that they need, right? They have to go through a physician. So we have a slightly more complicated model, but it's a very important issue. And the reason this is an important issue comes down to, what is brand perception, brand relevance, and so let's spend a little bit of time on that, Ramendra, right? brand perception is obviously important, right? It's what patients take away or consumers take away based on past interactions they've had with your product or your brand, right? And what kind of messages they resonate with them, what commercials they see on TV, things like that, right? So they form kind of this eventual trust or awareness, attention towards your brand, right? And that's something that is a little more long term earned, right? It doesn't, that was all fine and good until we got the smartphone, right? Now when you look at life sciences, coming to life science in your question, we are what ultimately we are looking at when we deal with products and especially to patients is what I call a pain experience. A pain experience has two things that I want to call out. One is it tends to be undesirable, right? It's different from like another industry in consumer packaged goods where I go into a grocery store and I'm dying to have vanilla ice cream and I really want it now and that's driving my choice, right? That's very different in the life sciences. Now I'm dealing with a condition that I really don't want, right? So I'm now, and the second characteristic is it tends to be very intense, right? When somebody has a pain experience, it's very intense, right? So you're dealing with these two challenges. One is they're expressing something about something they don't want, and they need to be heard now because it's fairly episodic and very intense. Even in cases like oncology, the pain experience can fluctuate, right, as we know. So that and emotional understanding of chronic diseases like cancer and other things, you really need to understand that to be able to engage a patient and make your brand relevant, right? And that is why this in the moment understanding of pain, which is what I call brand relevance, is extremely important now for remaining in you know the consumer's evoked set, that is the set of brands that they will actually stay with. Um, and and AI has helped us tremendously here because a lot of emotions and sentiment does not exist in numbers, right? We know that. And so for pharma and life sciences, the progress that we make in unstructured data and how we are able to integrate that with our structured learning so we can put the why and the what together to understand the relevance to a patient is incredibly important, right? So NLP, sentiment understanding, even things like auto ML, where you can kind of take a lot of even numeric data, but come up with like counterintuitive connections or patterns in that data, may give you an understanding of context or patient type or usage occasion which you didn't have before, right? So it has become mandatory for us to pressure test what we used to do before because now it matters more to us that we understand the immediacy of the experience as opposed to just that perception and assuming that perception is going to kind of stay over time. That has not been the experience of most companies, which is why you're seeing a lot of investments in like omni-channel and patient focused programming in the life sciences.
And are there any specialized systems you think, will be required for this, experience, managing the experience in real time, whether it is with respect to empathizing, probably suggesting, or how will it be managed? Will be good to know about it.
Yeah, so I think it all stems from an understanding first, right? So clearly the messaging. One of the things we still kind of do with messaging is it's still very much kind of in the words of a message, right? And tonality of the message and the empathy in the message
Mm.
is all contingent on understanding that experience the way it is conveyed, right? So, for example, if you go back to just plain market research today, we still do research where people talk, in an audio or video format, and then we kind of get crystallized notes that is some kind of summary of what was said, which completely misses the intensity of what was communicated and the sentiment behind it, right? So I think it's a fair question what you're asking. How are we going to kind of attack that and the learnings? But I think we're not there yet because we don't have the tools or the frameworks that will help us get deeper into it. For in some cases we have the technology, but compliance and privacy kind of restrict it, right? So for example, we can go look at video communication because it will reveal the identity of the speaker, which we obviously don't want in the life sciences, right, for HIPAA and other things. But it will fundamentally change the tonality of communication. Um, for example, in chronic diseases, there may be a continuum of care that goes well beyond just the product and the disease, right? It may require, and we're doing some of this, for example, in states like Alzheimer's, where you have kind of a caregiving environment which kind of needs to also be included in the continuum of care beyond the patient, right? So there will be those types of changes, but I think we will only know where that goes once we get more into things like multimodality, which I know we're going to talk about, which give us those rich insights that we've been waiting a long time to be able to understand. And it's not only the emotions here, right? I want to go back to, and maybe we can talk about this when we talk about multimodality, but this whole notion of being able to use a lot of unstructured data that exists in electronic records to understand the condition and the disease in kind of a more earlier in the course of when we engage, right now everything happens after the fact, but maybe there's information there that will help us understand uh, getting involved much earlier in before a presentation occurs. These are all things that we are hoping we'll be able to do with AI frameworks and being able to apply AI frameworks to the rich reams of data, both structured and unstructured.
So let me get into multimodality now itself. So we've talked about a number of unstructured data sets and marrying them with the structured ones. Putting together a set of analysis which can help both in terms of improving experience as well as similar use cases, or implement the commercial decision making in a much more profound manner. How do you see this integration happening, right? And give me some examples. What are you looking at?
Yeah, so this has to begin with a recognition that the nature of data itself has changed, right? We have this bias in analytics. I think it's actually across industries, right, where we tend to go straight to numeric, and which is good because it's available. It kind of is reflective of behavior, but the bias exists because we all grew up with like relational and hierarchical representations of data, right, and data points. We have to fundamentally recognize that we are now in a vector age, right? That data can be vectorized and it is agnostic to structure, right? And what that allows is the why and what to be understood in kind of an elegant capsule of information, right? So if you go into like retrieval augmented generation or any other knowledge graphs, these give you really good nodes of insights and interrelationships between nodes of insights, agnostic of structure, right? Which is remarkable. I almost go back to the early days we used to do like principal components analysis and factor analysis, and you know you remember those days, right? Where
Yeah,
we
absolutely.
thought, hey, there's a lot of data, let's kind of try to encapsulate them into clusters of information in some hierarchy. We are now able to do this with unstructured formats as well and integrate them, right? So let's step back and examine this a little bit, right? And I'll tell you a couple of cases, which are really interesting. You could have a drug that right now intervenes post the behavior or post the presentation of a patient after they've developed a disease, right? There is in an electronic health record, textual notes of conversations people have had with their physicians leading up to possibly the presentation. There is scans of things they've done that are kind of stitched to the record. There's potentially audio stuff that happens in an office that in some cases people have. We don't use any of it. We'll obviously cannot as of this time because there's a privacy issue, right? But these are still data that might be diagnostic of very many things that now can also be analyzed, because in that age of multimodality, we are still kind of nascent here, but we will get to a point where our frameworks allow us to tap into these types of resources, right? So one of the things that I think a number of companies are looking at is, can we get into AHRs and EMRs in some kind of a clean room setup where we don't have access obviously to the privacy of information, um, because it'll allow us to kind of hit these types of analytics and enhance our understanding of disease, patient presentation, usage context, usage occasion, all of these types of things, right? This is a gold mine, right? Separately, of course, there's the whole sentiment understanding, because we are, if we look at, for example, biologics, right? These are the large molecules that we deal with. There was a time when the only biologic out there was in diabetes, right? And then we got into, arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, and then oncology. Now we have conditions, and I was recently working on one, on Dupixent at Regeneron. These are conditions that are, or obesity, right? If you look at obesity, these are very patient relatable conditions. They're very complex in the biology, but they're very easy for a patient to relate to, because they actually see their symptoms, or they can express how they feel. With cancers, it's more hidden sometimes, and it's very complex, and it's so in states like this, people are able to articulate how they feel when they express themselves, right? And multimodality will allow us to develop communications and engagement models much, much better, right? Because we need to understand why somebody is saying what they're saying. Why do they feel the way they do? Um, and there have been many instances. I can't specifically, mention any of these because of confidentiality, but there are cases where we've seen and learned, something behind a person expressing a thought that is much richer and deeper, because we were able to get underneath it using some kind of analytic engine to understand what they're saying and connect it to something else that they're saying, and eventually into how they're behaving, right? Those linkages are I think really, really, really interesting. So multimodality is there's an author I like to follow, Brene Brown. You've probably heard of her, but Brene Brown has referred to stories uh, in data, right? In a very nice way, that it that they're really stories. If you can make every data piece into a story that is loaded with emotion and understanding, it is much, much more powerful than just using data alone, right? And it is something that I think is very important in multimodality, that we will get underneath the whys and the whats together, by using all of the rich sources of data that we have. And I am very, very gung ho about multimodality, right? I can't really wait for this to come in, because I think it's going to change the way we start looking at data in general.
Yeah, I think a lot of technology progress is obviously there to make it work. But I also feel that there is still a lot of work required in putting together the right kind of use case, and how it is going to be used, things related to that. The other aspect with respect to this unstructured data, and I wanted your view on this, that see, we have been managing structured data for a very long time, right? Databases, and there has always been more emphasis on it. But unstructured data, and there is huge set of it, almost like 80% of world's data is unstructured. That's what statistics are saying. How do you see that, how do you actually cut the noise, right, which is there in this data? How do you make sure you are able to pick up the relevant stuff without really boiling the ocean, or hitting LLMs all the time to review each page of the document and things like that. I think that is where probably there is certain level of complexity in my mind.
And that's a fair point, right? Which is why when you had the data strategy question, I think this comes back to that, right? You can't have the tail wag the dog, right? That is a problem, because if you do that, you'll never run out of data to keep wagging the tail, right? Because there's so much of it. You've got to have your strategy drive your question, right? And if you don't know what your question is and you've already gone down the rabbit hole to try to analyze it, you're in trouble, right? And I think with multimodality, it's even more complex because there's even more data, right? And when we have that technology that integrates everything, you'll never know where to stop. But if you have your strategy focused as to, I need to understand this, and I need to examine all the data sources that are pertinent to that, right? And I need to obviously look at, data sources that I know are governed, that are not like willy-nilly all over the place. And that's where governance becomes very important in these types of things. It gives you a very focused way to kind of get to, the solution, right? Which cuts out that it won't entirely do away with the noise, but it really, I think, helps avoid a lot of the noise, because I think the mentality we need to get out of is the funnel has a mouth and we got to throw everything in, right? And then, like you're saying, there's no end to that, right? And it's like you always have this expectation we learn something, and you might never learn anything, and even if you learned it, it might be the wrong thing. So, I think to answer your question, we have to come back, and this is one of the things that has not changed in the 30-year journey, right? Is you have to be focused with the business objective. You have to start with, why am I doing what I'm doing? If you don't do that in this day and age, it's not going to get us anywhere, right? And the analogy I keep coming back to, even though it can be dangerous, is GPS, right? If I don't know I'm going to a place and I just use my GPS, I'll go all over the place and I won't know where I'm going, right? That is the same in analytics, and it's the same in the data journey. Is strategy has to dictate, what the data strategy should be, what data is required, what the AI ambition is to be able to get us from place A to place B. And we have to be very disciplined to operate in that manner, because otherwise it's going to go off the rails very quickly. I think this is the single reason you see a lot of companies piloting things but not scaling them, is because their business strategy is not the driver of their AI ambition.
Right. I think, earlier people used to ask that, what data do I have? And, what can I do the best from that data? What insights can I get? And, how I can use it? The way probably to think about it now is that what outcome do I really need? And for that, what data is required along the journey? And probably with the technology available, with the integration available, we should be able to get those data sets and be able to achieve those outcomes. Maybe that's a way of thinking which is shifting as well.
Yes, and I think this is why, the value of data is going to become important, because, once you kind of put limits on the value you're getting to the decision, or the impact on the original question I asked, you have to examine what data is critical to be able to answer that question. You'll never have all the data,
Yeah.
and costs of using LLMs and engines like that are only going to become more expensive. And so those are the limiting factors, right? And I think we are already going into that age where, there's a much more disciplined look at, what data do I really need to answer that question in a better way than I used to do before. What we can have is keep it the way we had before, which is a very voracious acquisition appetite, but zero look at the value at the end of the funnel. That those days, I think, are over.
Yeah. And a related, now that we are talking about multimodality and, the new ecosystem which is emerging, one of the things we have to touch upon is the agentic, ecosystem, which is of course, is in early days, but I think it's a lot of promise. There is a possibility of having autonomous enterprises, processes being run autonomously, and agents actually playing a big role in the entire functioning of enterprises. Though in my view, my POV here is that it's a journey. It's not going to happen immediately, depending on the stage organization is in. And also there's a lot changing around us. It's the entire transactional systems are changing, the data systems are changing. In fact, the platforms are changing. So there's a lot of movement which is happening around the ecosystem itself. Now, how will you eventually create a more AI native enterprise? That will also depend on how this ecosystem is shaping up. But one thing is clear, that with agentic AI, we're trying to put together intelligence, workflow, humans, agents all together more in real time, to be able to get into a very agile enterprise. Now, when we think of this human agent collaboration and upcoming agentic ecosystem, how do you think this is going to span out in a highly regulatory organization, which is like, let's say pharma or life sciences? How will these systems look like? I'm sure that human in the loop is an important element, but what are the other things you think are important while thinking about agentic AI in pharma? And also keeping the entire you know I would say process safe, while implementing it.
Yeah, so you know, agents, obviously everybody is talking agents, but many people are talking about agents in isolation of why and where an agentic deployment makes sense, right? And let's come back to where we started this discussion, which is value, right? I think one of the things that will never go away, irrespective of agentic or non-agentic, is ultimately to invest in a system and to scale it. It has to generate value, right? So I think the best way to tackle this, and one that I've kind of used, is what I call the agentic matrix, right? And this is out in the public domain. It's a fairly good framework, and
Mhm.
what this does is essentially it's a 2 by 2 matrix. That has frequency on one side and value on the other, right? So you have 4 cells. You have your high frequency, high value, high frequency, low value, low frequency, high value, low frequency, low value, right? And each of these has some use for agentic implementation, right? So let's just talk about it in that sense, because it makes a lot of sense, right? So if you take low value, low frequency, these are things that happen once in a while. People don't really care that much about it. It kind of, and everybody has this. This is the long tail of that distribution, right? There are all these isolated activities. Nobody wants to kill it because somebody in the C suite really wanted it. These require a real examination in the agentic world, right? Do we really need to continue these things? Do we need to kind of drop it all together? Do we need to kind of slow this down? Because if nothing else, if it's not giving you that much value, it's still adding to cost, especially FTE cost, that you could actually redeploy in a budget neutral way to agentic implementation elsewhere, right? So that's the first box I think you got to start with, and look at all of your activities in a very objective way, and look at these two dimensions, right? How often am I doing something, and how valuable is it? And so I think smart organizations start with redundancies, and so that's the first box I would start with. The second one is low value, high frequency, right? And these are typically your reporting type stuff. There's a lot of static KPIs, for example, that just happen routinely. Every organization I've been at, these arrive most recently in emails, before in hard copy, very colorful. I don't know how many people actually look at everything in it, but they keep showing up, right? And they consume a lot of human resources. These are clearly something that I think you want to look at to automate, right? Because they typically go off business rules. They might need a little bit of human oversight to kind of cross check the numbers at the end, but the production of it could be automated, right? And you know when you need it, you know what business rules need to go in to generate these, you know who's kind of going to look at it. So that's where you want the little check, but it's mostly automation, right? The ones with high value, high frequency, these are your core workhorses of the business, right? This is where augmentation, I think, is really going to have a play, right? And these could be single task agents, they could be multitask agents, right? And the same is true, of the other box, which is, I think it's high frequency, low value, right? This is so, these are cases. For example, I'm trying to think of a forecasting agent that kind of automatically talks to a supply chain agent, right? This could shave off remarkable amount of time, right? Because typically what we do is there's a very manual process of, okay, here's the forecast projection for the market. You know, this needs to be given to supply chain. They need to look at it. They need to plan how much should be, they should be planning for. All of this can be automated, right? Will it require oversight? Most definitely, yes, right? Number one, in life sciences, I think anywhere you have a multitask agent, you're going to need human in the loop. But you definitely want an augmented solution as opposed to, the traditional all people solution, because there are interdependencies that agents will really help you leverage, right? So and there are some other obvious ones in life sciences that really should go into full agentic. For example, as I told you earlier in our conversation, our data is very messy, right? We have missing values, and we have, like, all kinds of data quality issues. Those all typically have rules, right, that can be implemented via an agent and expedited, right? So a DQ agent, for example, might be another one that could be made into a autonomous, mildly human in the loop type thing that will have remarkable benefits in the life sciences, right? So I think what I would not do, which a number of companies out there I know are still doing, is talk about agentic in isolation of where is the value you could recover, and not examine what you're doing today without an agent, and how much incremental value will an agent really provide when you kind of put all the math together in terms of people and the needs and all of that, right? So this is where I think taking a look at the future of the workplace from a business standpoint makes sense. You got to map your activities and look at what are your resource needs going to be in the future, how are they being kind of managed today, where do agents have a place, and where does frequency and value really matter in terms of getting an agentic map together or an agentic journey together, and then kind of invest in agentic. I think this is the way this is going to uh, pan out.
Yeah, that's an interesting framework, Arvind. Though it's similar to how you will look at from a digital automation perspective. There are certain similarities, but I think the important aspect here is to understand that how many resources and humans are involved in that activity as well, because somewhere the difference is that some part of that cognitive intelligence you can now put it into agents, as compared to earlier digital systems which are not really intelligent per se. So but I think the framework remains very relevant in deciding that how and what you got to do. The other thing which probably we could also touch upon is this high value low frequency category. I was just thinking that if there are activities which are very critical for the organization, where you may have tied up more resources, and there may be more cost attached to it, with a very specific skill required to address it. Will that be a good idea to actually spend some time if there can be specialized agent to do those activities? I'm not sure if technology can support that today, but that's an area where I was thinking probably one could look at as well.
You're talking high frequency, low value, right?
I'm talking about low frequency, high value.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, low frequency, high value, where probably let's say something where which is business critical, and you have too much dependency on particular people, or particular organizations or things like that. There may be a way to look at that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is definitely an area for augmentation. It depends on obviously the use case itself.
Yeah.
But because the value is high, I think in life sciences, anytime you have high value, that will require human in the loop, right? We may get to an autonomous system, but I think value will not be compromised. And I don't think this is unique to the life sciences, right? But I completely agree with you, Ramendra. It is going to be required because we can't continue to have loads of humans kind of doing all stages of something that the organization we know uses, but it can definitely be bolstered by an agent, right? So the early setup tasks that are more kind of mechanical kind of get stacked up for a smaller number of humans to kind of oversee. We're already
Right.
seeing a lot of that, and I think this speaks to the upskilling and things like that, where people have kind of this holistic view of this AI agentic you know workflow. So they're not just the engineers, but they're also kind of the overseers, the curators, the storytellers. I think that is all going to come together as agents mature. You're absolutely right about that.
Arvind, in the next round, we want to do a quick rapid fire with you. I'll give you two options. You have to pick one. No luxury of saying both here. And if you want, then you can probably have a one-liner, probably stating why did you choose this option. Yeah. All right. Are
Sounds
you
good.
are you game for it?
Yep, I'm ready.
Okay. Let's get started. AI that explains itself, or AI that simply works?
AI that simply works, because AI that explains itself doesn't can explain what it did, but we don't know whether what it did is actually the right solution. So since I'm forced to pick, I'm going to go that way.
What matters more to you, using AI to predict what will happen next, or using it to generate new content, ideas, output, predictive
Uh,
versus generative?
right now, I would say predictive, because I think it has higher returns. We know that, and it can also be managed more autonomously than generative in the current environment.
Okay. Multimodal AI or specialized LLM built for pharma?
I'm a big fan of multimodal. If it wasn't obvious earlier, we cannot continue to ignore unstructured formats in the life sciences.
All right. Omnichannel or hyper personalized?
I would go with omni-channel scale right now, because I'm not hyper personalized would be good if we could implement hyper personalized solutions. I see most companies still kind of not there yet. So until we the implementation catches up, I will go with omni-channel scale.
What is looking more possible, agentic autonomy or human in the loop always?
Human in the loop. In you can be in the life sciences and say otherwise.
Model accuracy or real business impact?
Real business impact. I love that, because, as I said, you have to be a perfect imperfectionist, and you have to be impact driven, and you have to guide an enterprise to a better decision. That is the key.
From a AI perspective, should data and AI be run centrally, or business teams have freedom to innovate locally? What
Business.
will be preferred?
Yeah, I would go with the business, because um, business strategy is written by the business, and it guides both the data and AI journey. So it's got to be customized to a business unit. It can be centrally managed.
Data platform or decisions platform?
Decisions platform, because when you are operating at a higher point in that analytic journey, it's all about the outcome.
Excellent. Arvind, thank you so much for all those responses. I loved, absolute clarity on some of the point of views you have, and that reflected in almost across the responses. The next question is a bit more forward looking. Let's say that if you had an opportunity to have 5 minutes with CEO of a pharma biotech firm, and you could pitch one data AI investment that would fundamentally change their commercial competitive position over the next 3 years, what use case would you pitch, and what metrics would you promise to move?
Yeah, so I mean, this obviously depends on whether they have, a cloud-based architecture in place, cloud data warehouse or a data lakehouse, Databricks or Snowflake. If they don't have that, obviously that would be my absolute first recommendation, because connected data is where the gold is. AI does not work unless you connect the data, and you can bring a lot of things into your environment. So that would be my number one if they didn't have that. If they had that, I would say something that has some kind of an AI analytics engine on top of that that can kind of really run, various types of AI on all of the data pieces that exist. This would be something, something like Cortex AI or something in Snowflake, where you have the ability to seamlessly start using AI on all your data in L1, L2, L3, and you're able to bring in user interfaces that can kind of be supercharged with AI engines. So that would be my answer in terms of what I would ask them to do, and clearly the metric there, if you didn't have a lake house or a cloud data warehouses, you're going to start seeing analytics that is more industrialized, rather than cottage industry one-off things, where analytics becomes a way of doing business, and it will lead to much higher returns both on the top line as well as on the bottom line. And I would do the same with, the AI engine that I was talking about. Is agility would be a metric to look at. Uh, the ability to bring in, formats outside of numeric, so the why and what insights. These would all be very powerful for the C-suite, and are becoming bread and butter for our industry in the forward journey.
So it's mostly getting the foundations right, creating a kind of factory scenario instead of focusing on one specific use case or two specific use cases. It has to create an ecosystem where you are able to deliver use cases across the board in a much more agile manner.
Correct. You've got to first have the basics to get started, and then you got to start it. So I'm biased in that because there's a lot of pieces in between, as you and I both know, right, with governance, but these are two critical things, and I think a number of companies either are reluctant to get started with establishing the foundation because they see it as very expensive, even though there's a significant payback. Or if they've already put it in there, they are kind of reluctant to kind of start doing some of the AI stuff that we already have available. And that's kind of why I went with the answers that I went.
Excellent. I think that also reflects on the state of the industry and what you want, the industry to move towards. Arvind, we are almost at the closing. One last question. I would like to have three takeaways from you, based on your vast experience and what you're seeing now. As to what should be the top priorities of data and AI leaders in life sciences and pharma space, which you want them to prioritize as they are moving towards embedding AI into their ecosystem.
Yeah, so my response here is going to be very much for people in the data analytics area who kind of work with the C-suite and stakeholders. So, and I use this often, and I've had this for a while, so I'll share that with you here as well. One is, I think it's very important as we have all this data that as practitioners, we don't get lost in the data, right? That we don't just allow people to look at data. Our responsibility is to actually have them see what's in the data. Those are two different things, right? So the recommendation number one is put in more energy into getting people to see what's in data than just looking at data, right? Second one is one that I say we need courage as insights and analytics practitioners. And so you've got to let go of the shore if you've got to see the horizon, right? So you can't just be comfortable with dashboards. I'm coming back to my favorite piece here, but you can't just be complacent with how you're doing things, because very quickly that won't work. And I think true success in the future is going to be people who are deliberately making themselves uncomfortable with things they're very good at today, right? So that would be my recommendation, not just for practitioners but also for executives who make decisions, right, in terms of a culture of data driven objectivity. And the third one is one that is an analogy from the world of marathons, right? Is you've got to be focused on the mile you're in. You can't be focused on the finish line or never start the race, because if you don't start the race, you're never going to finish. And if you don't focus on the mile you're in, you're still not going to finish because it seems overwhelming. And that's true of AI, right? So you got to kind of start, and once you start, you got to look at what is going on in the enterprise today and keep chugging along. You can't just watch and wait and say, I'll wait for somebody else to do something, because it's never going to happen. It's changing too fast. So those are the three things, Ramendra, that I would share. I think that culture is very important for the age we're in, with all of the change in the analytics discipline that's going on.
All right. Thank you so much, Arvind, for all the insights. I really loved the conversation, the frameworks which have come out of it. And I'm sure that this will resonate with a lot of folks in the industry as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ramendra. I really enjoyed it as well. And I must tell you, I do a few of these, but I absolutely loved your questions, because they've really made me think. And I would love to know a little bit more of, what you do. And because I think the approach you bring to this area is very refreshing. And so I look forward to that conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Means a lot, coming from you. And I think it's been a great conversation. I'll be in touch with you, and we'll take our other conversation forward as well. Yeah.
Cheers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.